Okay, we're going to get into how we document how you're going to get paid as a buyer agent in a specific situation where the seller or listing brokerage is offering compensation to the buyer and buyer agency. You're going to be using a form called the Real Estate Brokerage Compensation Agreement. You will have heard it referred to on the video about the 5 different scenarios that can come up about how you're going to be paid. So we're going to go through this form. If it doesn't look familiar, don't worry, it's a newer form. So let's get into it. Remember, this is how you're going to document that you're going to get paid. First step, of course, is understand that this is for use when the listing brokerage or seller have already agreed in writing in their ERS to pay a commission to the buyer agent or brokerage. As buyer agent, we have to determine what that is by contacting by the buyer agent or the seller agent. Contact them either by text, email, or phone. If you call and say, hey, I've scheduled this appointment, just need to know what the situation is, and they'll tell you what it is, follow up with an email or follow up with a text so that you also have that same number in writing. Hey, just writing to confirm, please confirm this is the email, so that you've got it in writing. And then my recommendation, make sure that a copy of that is in your transaction file as a communication to verify that. Now, once you've done that, you're going to complete this form and indicate either the dollar amount or the percentage of acquisition price that's being offered as the compensation amount. And you'll understand why I say or in a minute when you see the file. This then has to be signed by 4 people: the seller's brokerage and seller, and the buyer's brokerage and buyer. Well, you'll sign as the buyer brokerage representative, and obviously your buyer will sign, and this will then be sent with whatever offer they make. Send this ahead of the REPC so that that's there, and then they go through the REPC. A copy of this signed by all 4 parties, along with all the other documents of any other transaction, is provided to title so that title will use this for escrow instructions for distribution of funds at closing. We can no longer just use escrow instructions to cover this. This is the state approved form. You'll see where it makes some specific references in just a moment. So to start with, at the header, this should look real familiar. This is the same as any other form that we work with the sellers. Is between the real estate brokerage agreement is between seller's brokerage. Make sure you put the seller's brokerage on there. And then the buyer's brokerage, Prime Real Estate Experts, LLC, in contemplation of a potential real estate transaction between buyer name and seller name. I know it's a little confusing that they reverse the order. Just watch and make sure you get buyer and seller in there regarding the property located at the property address. Because this is an agreement between brokerages, both brokerages must be stated, as well as the principals, the buyer and the seller. And make sure the address is in there so that we know where it's going. Paragraph 1, the agreement is effective as of the date it is signed by all authorized signers and terminates on end date. In the event this agreement expires while the property is under contract to be sold between the buyer and the seller's brokerages mutually agree the term shall automatically extend until the under contract transaction closes or cancels. In other words, if you put this as good for 30 days, when you put in the offer, and things go back and forth and it takes a little longer than 30 days to complete, you don't need to update this. It automatically is considered valid until the transaction either closes or cancels. That way it's either been executed or is dead. Either way, it's completed its term and this has fulfilled its responsibility. You don't have to put it in a month or keep adding time to it. Compensation. This is where we put the amount. The dollar amount if they've agreed to a dollar amount, or the percentage of the gross acquisition price. This has been said over and over in other videos. You're going to hear it again because it's a term we have to relearn. Gross acquisition price. There will not be net listings anymore. Gross acquisition price, whatever is agreed to the purchase price, that's what it's based on. We're not taking subtract out all of the concessions and everything else like we were with that before. It is gross acquisition price. Provisions. Buyer's brokerage has a written buyer-broker agreement that obligates the buyer to compensate the buyer's brokerage. That's clear to both sides. Buyer and buyer's brokerage agree the buyer's obligation may be satisfied by a third party. This is where we restate to the seller that the buyer knows that the seller can do this. Buyer's brokerage may not accept compensation from any sources greater than the buyer's obligation. So again, if you signed a 2.5% BAC with your on your buyer broker agency agreement and the seller's offering 3%, you can't get that 0.5% difference without either updating the BAC first or stating on this that the amount would be 2.5%, whichever's on the BAC. But this can only be the amount that's being offered by the seller. We cannot change the seller's amount on this. That's a separate form. So find out in advance. This is why I again recommend put 3% on your EBB and then decide based on those 5 scenarios, if it's less than that, how you're going to take care of it. This certifies that the seller's brokerage has an ERS that allows this to occur. Payment of compensation by the buyer's brokerage is conditioned upon successful closing of the real estate transaction and shall be due on closing. Fairly straightforward. If it doesn't close, we don't get paid. Arbitration and attorney's fees. This is the similar to what's in the REPC, the ERS, the EBB, all of those. In that, if there's any dispute, shall be first submitted to arbitration. This is a difference between the ERS and the EBB. You notice may or shall or may to mediation. This states specifically shall first be submitted to arbitration. By signing this agreement, any non-NAR members consent and participate to agree in arbitration as well. If you are working with a forced sale by owner and they sign this, they have to understand that they are bound by the NAR's rules to go to arbitration. Now, like you can put any additional terms in here if those are negotiated with the listing agent, those terms and through the listing agent to the seller, any additional terms that they may want to put into this agreement, there is a space for that. Then finally, the signatures. Seller's brokerage, buyer's brokerage. Both have to sign. You'll notice seller's brokerage and buyer's brokerage sign here. Buyer and seller sign here. So this goes back and forth between we send it over, get it signed by the seller's brokerage, send it to her, and make sure that it's signed by, it has to be signed by all 4 parties. So make sure that is taken care of. Now, in practice, we can do that with the offer. But make sure you got signatures for the brokerage and for your buyer individually, and then get it back from the seller's brokerage signed by the seller and the seller's brokerage and seller. If you choose to do that prior to putting in an offer, then make sure that all 4 signatures are in place and a copy of this is still included with the offer. But this will be unique in that it has to be signed by all 4 parties now. Again, this is if the listing agent or brokerage or the seller themselves are have offered a compensation and they're in an agreement already through the ERS to sign that.